You will perhaps. So once again, it is my pleasure now to introduce Kate Elliot, PhD student in the Department of Urban Studies, with her lectures today on cemeteries, life in the city. Kate.
Thank you so much, and welcome all of you. This is such an exciting opportunity for me because I'm really interested in spaces that I think are kind of invisible or that are underappreciated in our cities. And cemeteries fit that in a number of ways. So today I'm hoping to explore with you what you think of cemeteries and what they're like. And if you've ever visited one, you'll have an opportunity in a second to test some of your knowledge about cemeteries or your attitudes about cemeteries. So if you look at this aerial view from the 1930s, this is not Vancouver, but if you look down, you might assume you can see these little tiny squares of neighborhoods, and then you can see this large space in the center that you might mistake for a park. But actually it is a cemetery growing up in the center of a very urban/suburban environment. And we do mistake them for green spaces because they kind of are, but we often don't think of them as parks. So I would like to know from you what you think about cemeteries. And Caitlin's going to launch a poll that's optional, but I really do invite you to respond to all of the questions, and there are about 8 of them, and just super curious to know what your experience is with cemeteries and what your willingness is to actually participate in activities in a cemetery. So most of you have been to a cemetery, visited a cemetery. What about the next question? Oh, Caitlin, do I share the results? Oh, okay, good, awesome. Would you jog through the cemetery? Yes, good, excellent, very healthy. Awesome. People do jog through cemeteries. You are allowed to do that. I wonder what you would say to taking your dog for a walk in the cemetery. A lot of people do that too. Yeah. And maybe you don't have a dog, but imagine that you did. Surprisingly, provincially, you're not allowed to take your dog for a walk in the cemetery, but because now dogs have become such a part of our families that many cemeteries just waive that rule and say as long as your dog is on a leash, you can absolutely visit a cemetery with your dog. Would you ever have a picnic in a cemetery? And we're going to talk about some conflicting views about that later. Maybe some of you have already had a picnic in a cemetery. You are actually allowed to do this. It's questionable in some cemeteries as to whether or not you could cook in the cemetery. And that tends to be a cultural thing and depends on the country as well. In many places, you're welcomed to come to the cemetery and prepare your food. And it's considered an invitation to be with the people that you might have lost and to bring them back and share their favorite foods with them. So yes, would you play rugby in a cemetery? So nobody so far. Wouldn't anybody play rugby in a cemetery? I would say that playing rugby in a cemetery would be not only very dangerous because you might fall or get tackled and end up hitting yourself against a grave marker, and those things are pretty solid. But it is also against the law in Canada because cemeteries are meant to be used for respectful, calm purposes. And that really is quite wide, but probably doesn't encompass playing rugby. So we're on the third to last question. Would you and your musician friends ever organize a concert in a cemetery? Ooh, interesting results for this one. And I'm curious to know the kind of music. Maybe after the presentation you can share what kind of music you would play. But absolutely, it would be perfectly legal for you to organize a string quartet in a cemetery, but probably not a rock concert. So yeah, interesting. And what about the second to last question? Would you ever get married in a cemetery? Some of you might think that that would be bad luck. However, it's perfectly permissible if the cemetery allows it to have ceremonies like that in a cemetery. And some of them are so beautiful that it would be a really special place if the weather were nice to actually get married. But there seems to be a unanimous no for that question. Okay, second to last, very last question, sorry. Would you live in a house in a cemetery if you didn't have to pay rent? And I want you to think about that for a second, how expensive rent is in this city, and what it would be like to live in a cemetery. Oh, there seems to be a unanimous yes for this one. I fully agree with you. In fact, I was offered the opportunity when I worked in a cemetery to live there. The cemetery groundskeeper, caretaker, took very ill in his health, and they needed somebody to live in the house on the cemetery. And I said yes right away, but that I would have to ask my life partner, who then, to my great surprise, was horrified and said, absolutely not. He would never live in a cemetery. That was really creepy. And I said, but it's rent free. And he said no. And by the time he'd changed his mind weeks later, it was too late and they'd found somebody. But it was really interesting to me how we talk so little about death and cemeteries that I had been with my husband for over 20 years by the time I discovered that he had these views about cemeteries, that he likes spending time in them, but would never live in them. And so I think this is something that's not uncommon in our cultures, that we don't really talk about cemeteries, and that makes them invisible. So you told me the things that you would and wouldn't do in a cemetery, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of the ways that I see cemeteries as being important in our urban spaces. So what is a cemetery? Is it a kind of real estate? Well, if we look at the fact that space for actually housing humans, land for housing humans, is under such pressure in the Lower Mainland, it's really important to start looking at the question of cemeteries as really valuable real estate. Here in Canada, you do not rent a grave plot. You actually pay a set fee, and that is a fee for life. You don't, once you've paid that off, that plot belongs to you and your family forever, in perpetuity, and that's the law. And so that's really interesting when we compare the land for cemeteries to other kinds of land in the city, because we do see an increase in the value of land and we actually have to pay more for that. But the cemetery land remains at a static price based on the moment that you bought that cemetery plot. So if you bought early when the land was cheap and when the cemetery was on the outskirts of town as opposed to on the inside, and we'll talk about that, how lucky for you and your family. But if you didn't, you might not be able to afford to bury your dead. And there are questions about whether or not it is even ethical in this day and age with so many homeless folks to give real estate over to the dead, or should real estate be reserved simply for the living? And I find that interesting because to me, a cemetery is a place of incredible life, and we'll talk about that. So some origins, just looking at real estate as an issue. Possible origins of the term, real meaning physical property, coming from Latin res meaning things, coming from rex possibly meaning king or royal, and certainly in this day and age, depending on the cemetery that you want to buy a plot in, you might have to have the salary of a king to be able to afford to bury somebody. And so people make some interesting choices that they wouldn't necessarily have made in their families 100 or 200 years ago with regard to disposition of the remains of folks that you've lost. So we look at cemeteries as the places where we bury humans, but this has been going on for a very long time, millennia, in fact. So burying the dead, and this happens even in some animal cultures, other species that are not human, where the remains of their dead are buried. So that's an interesting thing to consider, that we're not alone in this as humans. We maybe aren't as special as we think. But this is an example of a burial mound that has been recognized, and I might be mispronouncing this, Kenachiwa Nung Historical Center, otherwise known in the past as the Manitou Mounds. And this is one of Canada's most important and dense burial sites that's been recognized. that I say that's been recognized because when I think back to Bettina's land acknowledgement, we have to acknowledge that at any point in time, we could be standing on burial grounds that are ancient and not know it. These things are not actively sought after, and often we discover burial grounds by accident when we're looking at developing a piece of land and we have to do environmental tests. And through those tests, we determine, oh my goodness, this is actually sacred land to somebody, and there are actually human remains here, and then decide what to do with it. And so in this particular case, this was named in 1969 a National Historic Site of Canada. It's located in Northern Ontario, and you can visit it. But if you look at it, it looks like this beautiful nature space. And I just want us to think about that for a second, that places of death that we stigmatize because we're so afraid of death and dying, that really it is this cycle of nature, and that these are incredible nature spaces that regrow different forms of life. And that happens even in urban centers. And I want us to think about the fact that we think of burial as normal. But really, if we think widely, burial underground was not necessarily the traditional ways of some folks. And so if we look at North American practices from centuries ago, and even more recently, there were practices involving tree scaffolds and above ground scaffolds that were considered very organic. And the Indigenous folks who practiced this would have maybe considered that it was awful to be buried underground. And they offered bodies up to the sky, up to the elements, and allowed the weather to actually help with the decomposition of the bodies. But the bodies were also still there, wrapped in cloth. There were ceremonies and rites that accompanied this, and people could go and visit for the space of several months this individual that they had known and loved and respected or revered, and watch this process of their disappearance, which I think if we really think about our practices of death, we invisibilize that. And then we kind of expect people to just like, get over it, you know, your grief will disappear. And we don't really acknowledge that that relationship that we have with the spiritual human now is also a relationship that's ongoing with that loss of their body. And so it's really fascinating to me to know that this cultural practice existed, that people would have had those bodies above ground and may have been horrified at our concept of cemeteries. So I want to ask you about cemeteries as parks. This is not a cemetery. This is a very old aerial view of Central Park, designed by the figure on the right, Frederick Law Olmsted, who is, I have to say, one of my heroes, and he's long dead. But before he designed Central Park, and he was involved in designing many parks around the United States, but he's best known for this one because it is such an important protected green space that serves such a huge metropolis that is so hardscaped and made of concrete. And then here is this beautiful utopia in the middle of such a densely populated space. But long before designing Central Park, Frederick Law Olmsted already believed that nature could make people healthier, and he believed in bringing nature to cities. He was especially concerned with folks with mental problems, and in that day and age, you would have had what was considered insane asylums, where people were locked up if they were mentally unwell, and they may never be released. And he felt that this was very unwise, and that simply by planting nature spaces around some of those institutions, that the quality of life and the mental health of the folks inside could be improved. And better yet, allowing movement outside of those institutional spaces so that people could be in green spaces would make them healthier. Recent experiments with rats, okay, not humans, but I do have to say, you know, a lot of experiments that benefit humans are started with rats, have indicated that the mere smell of soil activates a positive chemical reaction in the brain that simply makes us feel happier. So if you think about the fact that when you were a child digging in the dirt, being in some nature spaces maybe has made you feel happier, that might be merely from the chemical composition of the dirt and how your brain reacted with the phenomenon of digging in that space. I am not encouraging going and digging in a cemetery, but I want to bring up the fact that there are multiple layers of health when we think about cemeteries as nature spaces, not just for the dead, but also for a variety of the living, not just the relatives of the people who are buried there. Frederick Law Olmsted's park was really important as well because it allowed people a place to come in their free hours and circulate. And when I think of going to a park, I don't think, well, I have to dress up and go to a park. But back in Olmsted's day, people did. New York was a place of class. There were the wealthy people. There were the slightly less wealthy people who wanted to be uber wealthy. There were the slightly less wealthy people than that. And then there were the poor folks who really didn't have very much money at all. And when you went to a park, you performed. You performed your class. And so people would actually dress up and be on their best behavior to go to the park. And whereas you can imagine that this was a place to be seen and kind of to show off, it was kind of a social media site, like actually in real physical space. And that was comfortable maybe for the wealthy folks, but not very comfortable for the not so wealthy folks. And so where did the not so wealthy folks go to find their parks? They went to the cemeteries. And because the cemeteries were places of death, and that's a bit spooky, those cemeteries were located on the outskirts of the city. And so while the wealthy folks would go to Central Park in the center of town to perform their class and be polite and meet and greet each other, some of the lower classes would end up going to the edge of town to spend a beautiful day with a picnic and be in a nature space in a cemetery. As towns grew up, and districts, and we look at our own municipalities, those cemeteries were absorbed into what became the centers of other municipalities and communities. So now they are urban cemeteries, even though they used to be rural cemeteries. Oops. So if we look at hierarchies, that still exists in the cemeteries, and you've probably noticed this. So this is a cemetery not like the one where I worked, where I had flat gravestones, and if you looked out across the cemetery, it looked just like a park until you noticed, oh, there are all these stones that are laying flat. And if you went and looked at them, you would know that they marked the lives of the people who were buried there. But a lot of cemeteries traditionally will have upright grave markers. And so this is a very common scene of a cemetery. And the larger the stone, or the more ornate the stone, the more important the person and the greater the reputation. And so spending money on death became a very important status symbol. And I'm going to show you some of those because they still exist today. And I find that really interesting to wander through cemeteries, even modern cemeteries, that still have this tradition of large monuments representing important families. So you've probably been to some cemeteries. All of you indicated that you'd visited cemeteries in the past, and maybe you've done that when you visited different cities in the world, because the older the cemetery, the more interesting the styles of architecture and statuary that end up being placed in those spaces. And so they kind of become places of art. They're like outdoor art museums. And so we look at families who could afford to commemorate lost members of their family with large statues. And on the right, these are Commonwealth gravestones, and they honor people, soldiers who fought in wars on the side of Commonwealth countries. And they will never, the only two stones at the cemetery where I worked that were upright were the Commonwealth stones, because it's the law with them that they are not allowed to be lying on the ground as the normal grave markers where I was working. So they did have to be upright. And we did have to go and check them from time to time because you get a heavy rainfall and stones, are affected by the shifting ground. And you need to make sure that you're honoring those. So think about also the upkeep of some of these cemeteries that have monuments like this or upright stones, and they do require a lot of effort on the part of the folks who are there. And remember that people pay a one-time fee for their burial space. So cemeteries are under a lot of financial pressure to pay the people who upkeep that land on a regular basis when there's not a lot of income coming in, especially for cemeteries that are already pretty full. So this is an interesting phenomenon in our urban cities. So there's the high and the low as well. If we look at how cemeteries get absorbed into spaces. So this is a little cemetery. This is real. There are skyscrapers all around it, apartment buildings, office buildings that all look down on this space. The cemetery where I worked, we used to get letters from people in the apartments above who would say, "Thank you so much. I have the most beautiful backyard garden." And I found that really neat because I'd never thought of a cemetery as somebody's backyard, but it is. And if we look at the high and the low as well, of course, there's the invisible low of the folks who are below ground and all of the micro critters who live below ground with them. So the vertical above and the vertical density below. There's so much pressure on cemeteries that people are not just burying at single depth, so one depth for one grave, but at double and triple depth. And believe it or not, that's complicated, and that requires special architects who specialize in cemeteries and engineers who specialize in how they're going to actually build down and not disturb remains that are already there. So depending on how a cemetery initially planned its layout, it can get very complicated to increase the density of what's happening below a cemetery space. And not everything is below. The simpler way to go about this is to have columbaria, you can see in the upper right. These are raised spaces, and I think of them almost like pocket drawers, where you might have urns with someone's ashes, and there will be a plaque. There are often flower holders, and people can come and water the flowers that are placed there. And any number of these can be located on cemetery property. And it's very space efficient if you want to think about it that way. But it's also really awesome in a time of climate change. So in many places in the world that are flood prone and where that is increasing with climate change, it's really dangerous to have people buried underground. When Hurricane Katrina hit, one of the things that we noticed was that all of the coffins and remains of folks who'd been buried were coming to the surface of the cemeteries, which was really distressing in all kinds of ways, but especially to the families of the folks who'd been buried there. And also there are all kinds of health issues associated with that. And then is that a kind of dishonoring of those folks, even though it wasn't the fault of anybody, it was a weather phenomenon, well, and perhaps some engineering phenomena too. But having columbaria protects from this, because these are structures that are more flood resistant and are still going to be there. And they're normally made of stone or concrete that can withstand a lot of flooding without specific damages. If you look down at the lower picture though, this is my favorite. So my family's always had a tradition of cremation. And we normally do something not very legal with the ashes. You're not supposed to dispose of ashes anywhere except in a cemetery space. And we normally will scatter people's ashes in our favorite ocean places because my family grew up on the ocean. And that's not allowed, but many people do this and don't realize that it's actually not legal. But cemeteries offer this as well. And one of the reasons for this is that it's nice to have a place to go, even if there's not something that's buried. It's nice to have a place that's associated with the human that you knew. And when I was working at the cemetery, the Ash Garden was a space where people would go and sit to sort of remember with the folks that they'd lost. And that was a special place. And I love the idea of the mixing of everyone's ashes into the soil so that people who would never have met each other because of time differences or because of different classes are actually intermingled in this one space. So there are also large monuments, like I mentioned. Mausoleums are they're like houses for the dead, and very wealthy families could afford to have these and still do. This is not the mausoleum. This is in Edmonton, and it's very rare. This was a wealthy family who could afford to have their own mausoleum. There was a mausoleum in the cemetery where I worked, but it had only 2 people in it. And it had space for 12, but there'd been a family argument, and it ended up that nobody wanted to be married with the nasty people who were already in the mausoleum, and so it was abandoned. And so it's just this beautiful piece of architecture in the middle of the cemetery and an important landmark. And I would say an important piece for the living. So whereas if you own a mausoleum, you'll notice that there's a lock on the gates of the mausoleum. You would have the key if your family owned that, and you could go in and sit with your ancestors. But what we found at the cemetery where I worked is that there was a homeless gentleman who would go and sleep in that space where you see there's a bit of sheltered ledge overhang, and he would sleep there because it was much nicer to sleep in a cemetery than on a sidewalk somewhere. And he'd get up every morning and say goodbye to the caretaker, and the caretaker would wish him a good day, and it was a very lovely relationship. So not lovely to be homeless, but lovely to have choice of some of those spaces, and interesting that a cemetery would be chosen as a desirable space to be. So it really brings up a question as to whether cemeteries are for the dead or for the living, and I would say equally both, and possibly more for the living. So let's look at the Philippines. In the Philippines, you do not buy your cemetery plot, you rent it. And that's a problem for a lot of folks. If I think about the people I know who own cemetery plots here, if they had to rent it year by year, they might not still have those plots. And so what happens for some folks in the Philippines and other countries as well, is that if they're renting and suddenly 5 years has passed and they can't pay the rent that year, there is a new kind of job that grave diggers don't just dig graves there to place people who are going to be buried. They actually dig graves to dig up the remains of the people who can no longer be afforded to be housed in those spaces. And what has happened, and I invite you to have a look at this fascinating documentary, Living with the Dead by Joel Tozer and Anna Maria Quinn. What happens is that people move in to live in the cemetery until somebody else has purchased those spaces. And so people will set up their homes in actual grave sites. And so children have grown up in cemeteries, some of them, schooled in cemeteries. This little boy here is flying a kite in the cemetery. So there's this aspect of very young humans being joyful and playing in a space of death. And I find that really compelling, and it really jostles at our ideas of what a cemetery is or should be. This gentleman in the documentary, when he was asked if he'd raised, how many children he'd raised in the cemetery when he was living there, laughed and said just a few. And it ended up he had raised 18 children and now had multiple grandchildren growing up and going to a school in the cemetery. Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia a few years ago decided that there was so much density and pressure on already the few green spaces that they had, that they needed to ensure that folks had green space to go to where they could actually stretch out and not be like right up close with other people. And I want you to imagine if you've ever gone to a crowded beach, or you've ever gone to the beach, and then you get out of your car, you get off the bus and you look at the beach and all the beach towels are touching each other. And you think, oh, I just kind of wanted some space to myself. And now imagine if that were the case at any of the parks that you wanted to go to. That was the case in Kuala Lumpur. And really the government knew that to be healthy, the urban population had to have access to these green spaces. And so it decided that it was mandating all cemeteries would now double as public park spaces so that folks could come in and enjoy some of that green, healthy freshness that would make them feel good. In other parts of the world, and so I take you to Denmark now, in Copenhagen has this interesting idea that within a few minutes, you should be able to walk to a green space, and that there should be also interconnected green spaces, not just for humans, but for wildlife. So we might refer to these as pollinator highways, that are spaces that are interconnected green spaces with flowers that are offering a safe refuge for those creatures that really need green spaces, and they don't really thrive on concrete and on our roads and sidewalks. And so the more of these that we have that are interconnected, even if they're small, the better the overall environment is. Because as we know more and more, what is good for the critters around us, the non-humans or the more than humans, is also good for the humans. So this is actually a very large cemetery space in Copenhagen. And you might think that the cemetery is only over onto the right, but that's not the case. This is a paved path that goes through the cemetery that is on both sides. And you'll notice skateboarders and cyclists who will also enter into those green cemetery places and maybe sit and read a book, have a conversation or a picnic. And I got this off of a YouTube video where an ethnographer was doing some research on what people thought was acceptable in a cemetery. And so there were a lot of couples who were asked about their preferences. And this one couple who had been married for quite some time discovered that just like my husband and me, they did not have the same views about cemeteries. And they spent a lot of time going to this one bench at the cemetery. They thought it was a lovely place to sit and relax. But the gentleman said, when asked whether he would ever eat lunch there, said, "Oh no, I would not do that." And his wife was like, "Well, I would eat lunch there." And then the interviewer said, "Well, would you have a barbecue in a cemetery?" And they were both, "No, definitely not." So everybody seems to have their very specific views about what is appropriate in a cemetery. And it doesn't necessarily fit with what the legal framework is, or even what the cemetery would allow. And you might be surprised if you ask cemeteries that a lot of activities are allowed at a very local level. And I want you to consider Mountain View Cemetery here in Vancouver. So Mountain View a few years ago decided, how can we invite the community into the cemetery to enjoy this beautiful, historic green space in the city that's huge? And they decided to celebrate All Souls Day, which is the day after Halloween, November 1st. And it has some religious connotations, some spiritual connotations, but it's also just a beautiful, it's my favorite time of year, fall. And they invited people to come in and participate in art, in evening light and dance shows. And they've been doing this for years. And on the photo on the right, you can look up their website and see projects that they've done over the past 5-6 years on All Souls Eve. But a lot of it involves participating, and people will come and create things or leave messages for each other or leave messages for people that they've lost and loved. And it becomes this community of shared loss, but also shared celebration of those people who were special to everyone in the community. There's not just cultural diversity and human diversity in a cemetery. There's also biodiversity with the more than human elements, the non-human critters. And so some of those that are very visible are trees. In the cemetery where I worked, and you can see these are different tree species here, but in the cemetery where I worked, the people who had established it had been thinking about pathfinding. And the way that the cemetery was laid out was very, I don't know, it wasn't very grid-like, and it wasn't like finding an address on a street. And so they had thought ahead and thought, well, if we plant some really interesting different trees in different places, we can say to people, oh yeah, so-and-so's buried just up the way by, you see that flowering tree? Or do you see my favorite? Do you see those two trees that seem to be dancing with each other? And so people would be able to identify where to find grave sites by trees as living monuments. And I find that really fascinating. But if you think about the services that trees offer, aside from shade for folks who want to sit underneath them and read, they offer also places to land for birds, places to nest. The cemetery where I worked had more than 8 countable bird species, and one of those was hummingbirds. And there were 2 warring tribes of hummingbirds who would come and have little fights with each other out of the cedar bushes. And it was just lovely for the people who would come to visit the cemetery, that it was so filled with life, especially for those who were coming to, to commemorate a loss. But there are life forms that are less charismatic, that are less attractive, that we might not really think of as life forms. So if you see these white patches on the upright stones, you might think, oh my goodness, that is bird poop. And you are wrong. However, one of the major complaint calls that I would get when I worked at the cemetery was people calling and saying, Kate, I really need for my grandfather's gravestone to be cleaned. It's got some dirt on it. And I'd say, oh gosh, I'll go have a look. And I would go have a look and I would see something like this, only on a flat stone. So I'd probably see a lot more because it was easier for these creatures to climb flat stones, because this is actually not bird poop, and it's not dirt. These are lichens and mosses and fungi who inhabit stone spaces. So cemeteries become, in urban spaces, unpolluted places where these creatures can find stones that become a really important part of their habitat. And these are, for those of you who are really interested in these life forms, they are networks of information sharing. And so I find that really compelling. And sometimes when I call and I'd say, oh, I went and checked your stone. I noticed there is quite a bit of lichen on it. And they'd say, what? And I'd explain what that was. And some folks then thought that was lovely and would do nothing about it. And other people would ask for the community of lichen to be removed. So I find that really interesting, that there are life forms that we are not trained to recognize that exist at the cemetery. And so I just want to think about biodiversity for a second, and I will end really, really soon. But a few years ago, there was a study in Germany, a study that had lasted 27 years, that looked at winged insect biomass. So all of the insect life that flies. And they noticed that 75% had been lost within a 27-year period. And if we think about cemeteries, this is so important, because cemeteries, most of them, do not apply pesticides. And so if you were a human seeking refuge, you would seek somewhere, a place, a geography where you would be safe. if you are an insect or another kind of critter seeking safety in a city, cemeteries offer that for a lot of species. And what's interesting is that because of that, new species are discovered in cemeteries. And entomologists who study insects are very excited to be able to work in cemeteries. What you see in the image is a jewel beetle. And it is not, I couldn't get the rights to show you the gold colored jewel beetle that was discovered as a new species in a cemetery tree recently, but new species are being discovered. And it's just really exciting that these places exist. And I think we don't celebrate that biodiversity enough. And just to finish off, the stories I heard and experienced when I was working at the cemetery were many. So on the right, you might notice in the upper right, a coyote. Families of coyotes would come and just relax in the cemetery. Urban spaces are stressful on critters. And so some of these critters seek cemeteries that are protected and calm and quiet, just to chill out. And that's what one of the caretakers said to me. He said, "Oh yeah, I see creatures here all the time and they just need to rest. Nobody bothers each other." And the best story he told me was about a black bear, and you can see an example on the left. This is not the same black bear. One day, the groundskeeper was taking care of the cemetery, and this frantic black bear, who was being chased through the neighborhood by angry, scared residents, lumbered over the fence really clumsily. It was exhausted and panting, and it collapsed in a heap under a tree and fell asleep. And the groundskeeper said, you know, he just needed a place to be. The poor guy didn't know where to go, and he found refuge in a cemetery. And I find that lovely, that this is a multi-species place where more than humans and humans can come together and find peace and nature. And so, as well as being a historical site where you can go and hunt up your ancestors on ancestry.com, this is a space for more than humans. And I encourage you to think about the future of cemeteries, which is at risk. So Katrina Spade is really interesting. This is my very last plug for being involved with your cemeteries. Human composting may replace cemeteries. Seattle was approved last year, and it just began this year, I think, to have spaces where humans can be composted instead of buried. It's very ecological, but what will that do for our appreciation of cemetery spaces? And this is what she worked on the Urban Death Project for a while, and it eventually became this thing called RECOMPOSE, this project of pods, where people decompose over a period of time, and you could essentially collect the remains of a loved one as compost and use it in your garden to grow food. People tend to have very strong feelings about that, but I can tell you that one of my grandmothers would have been thrilled to think that she would have been put to use growing something nutritious, because she was a farm person and grew up growing farm and was very proud of her carrots. So something to consider. And I'm curious to hear your questions now and to know what life you would like your cemeteries to have in urban spaces, or what you would like them to do for you, or how you would like to use them. So thank you so much for being here, and I hope that you have some questions.